Hello friends, welcome to Premier UPSC IS. So today we are going to continue the lecture 4 part of the modern history for prelims UPSC IS. So in the last part we have covered different civil uprisings. Today we are going to cover the tribal revolts and the revolt of 1857 directly. Let's dive into it. So before going, do subscribe to the channel Premier UPSC IS, like the video and please comment. Thank you. Introduction. The tribal movements can be categorized into mainland tribal revolts and frontier tribal revolts, concentrated mainly in the northeastern part of India. Following were the mainland tribal revolts: Paharia's rebellion, Chuar uprising, Kol mutiny, Ho and Munda uprisings, Santal rebellion, Kond uprisings, Koya revolts, Bhil revolts, and Mopla revolts. So these were the main, and there were following two main tribal revolts in the northeast region, such as Khasi uprising, Singhpur's rebellion, Pagalpanti movement, etc. So let's see what are the reason behind such revolts, that such tribal revolts with the British. Okay, the reasons for the tribal revolts in mainland are: the land settlements of the British affected the joint ownership tradition among the tribals and they disrupted their social fabric. As agriculture was extended in a settled form by the company government, the tribals lost their land and there was an influx of non-tribals to these areas. Shifting cultivation in forest was curbed and this added to the tribals' problems. The government further extended its control over the forest areas by setting up the reserved forest. They restricted the usage of timber and didn't allow grazing. The laws were of inclusive nature as the tribals had their own customs and traditions. The coming of Christian missionaries and their interference with the traditional customs of the tribals was resented by the tribals. The reasons for the revolt of tribes of the northeastern frontier were different from the mainland tribal revolts. Paharia's rebellion. The uprising by the martial Paharias took place in the Rajmahal Hills in 1778. They lived around the Rajmahal Hills, subsisting on forest produce and practicing shifting cultivation. With their base in the hills, the Paharias regularly raided the plains where settled agriculturists lived. Exasperated colonial officials tried desperately to control and subdue the Paharias, but they found the task difficult. Then, by the 1780s, Augustus Cleveland, the collector of Bhagalpur, proposed a policy of pacification. Paharia's chiefs were given an annual allowance and made responsible for the proper conduct of their men. As the pacification campaigns continued, the Paharias withdrew deep into the mountains, insulating themselves from hostile forces and carrying on a war with outsiders. The British were forced to usher in peace by declaring their territory as Dominico area. Chuar uprising. The reasons of Chuar uprising include famine, increased land revenue demands, and economic distress. The Chuar tribes lived in Mahal of Midnapur district and also of the Bankura district in Bengal. They were basically farmers and hunters, and uprising lasted from 1766 to 1772 and then again between the 1795 and 1816. The most significant uprising of the Chuar was under Durjan or Durjol Singh in 1798. The term Chuar is considered derogatory, hence it is called the Revolt of the Jungle Mahal. Kol Mutiny. The Kols lived in Chotanagpur, covering Ranchi, Singhbhum, Hazaribagh, Palamau, and the western parts of Manbhum. In 1831, a large-scale transfer of land was done from Kol headmen to the outsiders like Hindus, Sikh, and Muslim farmers and moneylenders who were oppressive and demanded heavy taxes. The judicial policies of the British also affected the traditional social conditions of the Kols. This caused the resentment. Under the leadership of Buddha Bhagat, the Kol revolted, killed, and burnt about 1,000 outsiders. Large-scale military operations were undertaken to suppress them. Ho and Munda uprisings. The Raja of Parahat organized the revolt of Ho tribals against the occupation of Singhbum. The revolt continued from 1820 to 1827 but was finally were forced to submit. In 1831, the Mundas of Chotanagpur joined their protest against the newly introduced farming revenue policy and the entry of Bengalis into their region. It was suppressed in 1832. Again in 1899 to 1900, the Mundas in the region south of Ranchi rose under the Birsa Munda. They became a force against the introduction of feudal zamindari tenures and exploitation by money lenders and forest contractors. The rebellion was suppressed and Birsa was captured and imprisoned. Santal Rebellion 1855 to 56. Santals were agricultural people who settled in the plains of Rajmahal Hills. The oppression by the zamindars and the moneylenders who also had the support of the police caused the resentment among Santals. They rebelled and this rebellion turned into an anti-British movement. Two brothers Sidhu and Kanhu led the revolt and proclaimed an end to company rule. They declared the area between Bhagalpur and Rajmahal as autonomous, but the rebellion was soon suppressed in 1856. Kond uprisings. The Konds lived in the hilly tracts extending from Odisha to Srikakulam and Vishakhapatnam districts of Andhra Pradesh. They revolted against the company rule. They were led by a young Raja by the name Chakrabisoi, joined by the Ghumsar, Kalahandi and other tribes. However, with the disappearance of Chakrabisoi, the uprising came to an end. There was another Khond rebellion in 1914 in the Orissa region to form an autonomous government. Koya revolts. The Koyas belonged to the eastern Godavari tract joined by Kondasara chiefs. They rebelled repeatedly from 1803 to 1886. A serious attempt was made in 1879 to 80 under Tomma Sora. They were against the oppression by police and moneylenders. The new regulations denied their customary rights over forest areas. Another rebellion was organized in 1886 by Raja Anantayar after the death of Tomma Sora. Bhil revolts. The Bhils lived in the western Ghats and controlled the mountain passes between the north and the Deccan. They faced a famine, economic distress, etc. Therefore, revolted against the company rule in 1817 to 19. The British used both force and conciliatory efforts to control them. They, however, revolted again in 1825, 1831, and 1846 and failed to make any impact against the might of the British. The coolies living in the neighborhood of Bhils also rose up in rebellion against the company's rule in 1829, 1839, and again during 1844-48. Mopla Rebellion. Unfairly high revenue demands by the company, reduction of field size along with the oppression of the officials resulted in the widespread peasant unrest among the Moplas of Malabar. 22 rebellions took place between 1836 and 1854, however, none of them proved to be successful. There was a second Mopla uprising when they were organized by the Congress and the Khilafat supporters during the non-cooperation movement in 1920. But the religious differences distanced the Congress and the Moplas from each other. By the end of 1921, the Moplas were subdued. Reasons for the tribal revolts in the northeast. These tribes shared tribal and cultural links with countries across the border. They did not concern themselves much with the nationalist struggle, and their revolts were for political autonomy within the Indian Union or complete independence. They generally were not forest based or agrarian revolts as they were in control of land and forest area because British entered the northeastern areas much later than the non-frontier tribal areas. Therefore, the northeastern tribal revolts under the British continued for a longer time than mainland movements. Desyncretization movements were widespread among these tribals. The important northeast tribal uprisings are Hazi uprisings. The hilly region between the Garo and the Jaintia hills was occupied by the East India Company. They wanted to build a road linking the Brahmaputra valley with the Sylhet and brought in a large number of outsiders, including Englishmen, Bengalis, and the laborers from the plains to build it. The Khasis and the Garos organized themselves under the youth Tirot Singh to drive away from the strangers. The uprisings developed into a popular revolt against the British rule in the area. The English military suppressed the revolt in 1833. Singhpo's rebellion. The Singhpos of Assam rose to revolt in early 1830 but was immediately quelled, yet they continued to organize revolts. In an uprising in 1839, a British political agent was killed. In 1843, the Singpo chief Nirangkidu led an uprising and attacked the British garrison and killed many of their soldiers. Some of the smaller movements in the northeast include the Mishmis Uprising of 1836, Khamti Rebellion of 1839 to 1842, Lushai's Revolt in 1842 and 1844. Pagalpanthis. Pagalpanthi was a semi-religious group made of Hajong and Garo tribes. It was founded by Karam Shah. However, the tribal peasants were mobilized and organized under Karam Shah's son Tipu to fight for the oppression of the zamindars between 1825 to 1835. They refused to pay rent above a certain limit and attacked the houses of the zamindars. The movement was violently suppressed. However, the government introduced an equitable arrangement as compensation to protect these peasants. Now coming to the revolt of 1857. Before diving into the revolt of 1857, we are going to see the reasons or the causes of revolt of 1857. Sepoy mutinies before 1857. There were a lot of sporadic military uprisings that took place before the 1857 revolt in different parts of the country. Mutiny in Bengal in 1764, the Vellore mutiny in 1806. The sepoys protested against the interference in their social and religious practices and raised a banner under the flag of the ruler of Mysore. The mutiny of the sepoys of the 47th Native Infantry Unit in 1824 in Barakpur, Grenadier Company in Assam in 1825, Indian Regiment at Sholapur in 1838, etc. Reasons of sepoy mutinies before 1857 were discrimination of the native soldiers in payment and promotions, ill treatment of the sepoys by the British officials. The company didn't pay foreign service allowance while fighting in remote regions. There were religious objections by the higher caste Hindus to Lord Canning's General Service Enlistment Act 1857, which ordered all recruits to be ready for service both within and outside the India. But they considered crossing the sea as loss of caste. The revolt of 1857 and causes. Exactly after a century of Battle of Plassey, a major revolt began as a reaction against the company policies. There were minor simmering revolts across the subcontinent, but they burst in the form of a violent storm in 1857. It succeeded in shaking the British Empire in India to its very foundations. The causes of the revolt in 1857 were similar to the earlier uprisings that we discussed so far. They emerged from all aspects socio-cultural, economic, and political, and from all sections and classes. Let us discuss the causes in detail. Economic causes. The revenue settlement policies of the company imposed heavy taxation and the peasants resorted to loans from moneylenders at exorbitant rates. This situation resulted in the eviction of peasants from their lands on non-payment of debt dues. The rural indebtedness plagued Indian society in this period. The company's rule ruined the handicrafts and added to the misery of the artisans. The company's annexation of Indian states cut off their source of patronage. The native rulers now could not afford to be patrons of the crafts workers. The British policy encouraged their manufactured goods and discouraged Indian handicrafts by imposing heavy duties on them. The zamindars, who were the traditional landed aristocracy, lost their land rights and hence their status in the villages. The zamindars and the talukdars seized the opportunity to oppose the British and try to regain what they had lost. Political causes. The company, in its quest for expansion, used the treacherous methods, broke pledges and promises. This resulted in contempt for many and company and loss of political prestige. There was suspicion in the minds of almost all the ruling princes in India. The doctrine of lapse denied the right of succession to the princess. Upon the death of the Mughal prince Fakhruddin in 1856, Lord Dalhousie conditionally recognized succession. Later, Lord Canning announced that the next prince on succession would have to renounce the regal title and the ancestral Mughal palaces. Administrative causes. There was rampant corruption in the company's administration, especially the police, petty officials, and the lower law courts. This was a major cause of discontent. The character of the British rule also imparted an alien look in the eyes of Indians because of the way they ruled. It was kind of absentee sovereignty. Socio-religious causes. The company officials had a superiority complex and had racial discrimination towards the native Indian population. So, moving forward, social religious causes. The company officials had a superiority complex and had racial discrimination towards the native Indian population. The Christian missionaries indulged in the conversion of Indians and were hence looked upon with suspicion by Indians. The socio-religious reforms such as the abolition of sati, support to widow marriage and women's education upset the conservative sections of the population. This was seen as interference in the social and religious domains of any society by outsiders. The government's decision to tax mosque and temple lands were seen as the control over the religious places by foreigners. The laws such as the Religious Disabilities Act 1856, which modified the Hindu customs, created dissent among the Indians of all religions. Discontent among the sepoys. The conditions of the service in the army came into conflict with religious beliefs and prejudices of the sepoys, such as the restrictions on wearing turban, the caste, and sectarian marks. There were also secret rumors of proselytizing activities of the chaplains maintained on the company's expenses, alarmed the sepoys who were conservative in nature. The higher caste Hindus of the time considered crossing the seas as the loss of caste. The emoluments paid to the British soldiers was much more than the native Indian soldiers. The sepoys also expressed dissatisfaction at not being given the foreign service allowance bhatta when serving in Sindh or in Punjab. The annexation of Awadh inflamed their feelings as most of the sepoys were from the region. The sepoy was in actual a peasant in uniform. Beginning and the spread of revolt. The sepoys received reports about the mixing of bone dust in atta, that is the flour, and the new Enfield rifle cartridge was suspected to be made of the beef and pig fat. The cartridge had to be bitten off before loading. The cow was sacred to the Hindus, and while the pig was taboo for the Muslims. Thus, the sepoys felt the religion was in grave danger. The greased cartridges acted as a spark to the simmering discontent to come out in the open. The sepoy first revolted at Meerut on May 10, 1857. It then quickly spread to a vast area from Punjab in the north and the Narmada in the south to Bihar in the east and the Rajputana in the west. Even before the Meerut incident, there were incidents of the show of resentment in various cantonments. 19th Native Infantry at Berhampur was disbanded in March 1857 for refusing to use the newly introduced Enfield rifle. At the 34th Native Infantry stationed at Barakpur, Mangal Pandey went a step further and fired at the Sergeant Major of his unit. He was executed on April 8 and his regiment was disbanded. The 7th Awadh Regiment also met with a similar fate on May 3. Then came the explosion at Meerut on May 9, 1857. Meerut incident. The sepoys of the 3rd Native Cavalry refused to accept the greased cartridges on April 24, and 85 of them were dismissed, sentenced to 10 years imprisonment and put in fetters on May 9th. Thus, a mutiny sparked off among the Indian soldiers stationed at Meerut. On May 10, other soldiers of the cavalry released their imprisoned comrades, killed their officers, and unfurled the banner of revolt. They marched towards Delhi, and in Delhi the local infantry joined them, killed European officers and the political agent Simon Fraser. Lieutenant Willoughby, who was the officer in charge at Delhi, offered some resistance but he was overcome. Bahadur Shah Zafar as leader. The soldiers proclaimed the aged and powerless Bahadur Shah Zafar as the Emperor of India. Thus Delhi became the center of the revolt and Bahadur Shah Zafar as its symbol. The recognition of the last Mughal king as the leader of the country was because of the long reign of Mughal dynasty. Mughals were a traditional symbol of India's political unity. Thus, a mere sepoy mutiny transformed into a revolutionary war. The other Indian chiefs who took part in the revolt also proclaimed their loyalty to the Mughal emperor. Bahadur Shah initially hesitated but finally gave in and wrote letters to all the chiefs and rulers of India. He urged them to organize a confederacy of Indian states to fight and replace the British regime. The Bengal army rose in revolt and spread quickly to Awadh, Rohilkhand, the Doab, Bundelkhand, central India, large parts of Bihar and East Punjab as well. There was a wide from most of the sections of society, peasantry, the artisans, the shopkeepers, day laborers, zamindars, religious mendicants, priests and civil servants, including civilians, participated in the revolt. However, educated and the upper class society didn't take part in this revolt. Centers and leaders of the revolt. The revolt spread to different parts of the country within a month after capturing of Delhi. The symbolic leadership was with Bahadur Shah Zafar, but the real command was headed by General Bakht Khan. He brought the troops from Bareilly to Delhi. Kanpur. Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the last Peshwa Bajirao II, led the fight from Kanpur, supported by Tatya Tope. Lucknow. Begum Hazrat Mahal took over the reins at Lucknow as the regent of her son Birjis Qadir, who was proclaimed the Nawab. Bareilly. Khan Bahadur, a descendant of the former ruler of Rohilkhand, was placed in command at Bareilly. He organized an army of 40,000 soldiers and offered stiff resistance to the British. Bihar. Kuwar Singh, a 70-year-old, the Zamindar of Jagdishpur, led the sepoys when they reached Arrah from Dinapur and mobilized the people in Bihar. Faizabad. Maulvi Ahmadullah, a native of Madras, had moved to Faizabad in the north. He fought a stiff battle against the British troops. Jhansi. Rani Lakshmibai at Jhansi was the most outstanding leader of the revolt and gave the war cry, "मैं अपनी झांसी नहीं दूंगी." He was joined by Tatya Tope after the fall of Kanpur. Both of them marched towards Gwalior, but Scindia supported the English. Suppression of the revolt. The might of the British was finally able to suppress the revolt. They captured Delhi on September 20, 1857, after prolonged fighting. John Nicholson led the siege but was severely wounded and died of injuries. Bahadur Shah was arrested and his sons were captured and were publicly shot at point blank range by Lieutenant Hudson. Bahadur Shah was sent to exile in Rangoon where he died in 1862. He was the last emperor from the house of Mughals and was finally and completely extinguished. Sir Colin Campbell occupied Kanpur and the Nana Sahib escaped to Nepal. His aide Tantya Tope carried on guerrilla warfare from the jungles of the central India. But he was betrayed by an associate of his and was captured while asleep in 1859 April and put to death. Jhansi Rani Lakshmibai died on the battlefield in June 1858 and recaptured by Sir Hugh Rose. By 1859, all the leaders were either dead or escaped, and the British authority over India was fully re-established. Reasons for failure of the revolt. Opposed by certain classes. Big zamindars acted as breakwaters to storm, even talukdars of Awadh backed off. Moneylenders and merchants supported the British. The educated Indians of the time saw the revolt as supportive of the feudal order. Some Indian rulers such as Scindia of Gwalior, the Holkar of Indore, the rulers of Patiala, Sindh and other Sikh chieftains and the Maharaja of Kashmir refused to join the revolt. Expansion in limited area. The territorial spread was limited as the eastern, southern and the western parts of India remained more or less unaffected. It could be because the earlier uprisings in these regions were brutally suppressed by the company. Lack of modern weapons. The Indian soldiers were armed with inferior weapons. They mostly fought with swords, very few guns and muskets. In contrast, English had the latest Enfield rifles and were also supported in communication through electric telegraph. Poor coordination and organization. The central leadership of the soldiers was poorly organized, which was no match to the exceptional abilities of the Lawrence brothers, John Nicholson, James Outram, Henry Havelock, etc. No central ideology. They lacked the clear idea of colonial rule and nor did they have forward-looking program with clear-cut political perspective or a societal alternative. Perspectives about the revolt. Different people viewed this revolt differently. Sir John Seeley of the British wrote it was a wholly unpatriotic and selfish sepoy mutiny with no native leadership and no popular support. Dr. K. Datta writes it was never all Indian in character but was localized, restricted, and poorly organized, but acknowledges it was more than a mere sepoy revolt. V.D. Savarkar, in his book The Indian War of Independence 1857, called it the first war of Indian independence. Dr. S. N. Sen, in his book 1857, considers the revolt as having begun as a fight for religion but ending as a war of independence. Dr. R. C. Majumdar considers it as neither the first nor national nor a war of independence as a large parts of the country remained unaffected and many sections of the people took no part in upsurge. The Marxist historians give a different perspective of the 1857 revolt that it was the struggle of the soldier peasant democratic combined against foreign as well as feudal bondage. Jawaharlal Nehru, in his book Discovery of India, considered the revolt of 1857 as essentially a feudal uprising, though there was some nationalistic elements in it. M. N. Roy viewed it as last-ditch stand of feudalism against the commercial capitalism. In final analysis, though each of the leaders had a personal cause for revolting and each had a personal interest to protect, but most of the national revolutions begin with the work of a minority with or without the active support of the masses. The revolt was first combined attempt of many classes of the people to challenge a foreign power. Thus, it can be considered the first great struggle of Indians to throw off the British rule. Consequences of the revolt of 1857. It was a turning point in the history of India due to the far-reaching changes it brought in administration and policies of the British. Even before the revolt was completely suppressed, the British Parliament in August 2, 1858 passed an act for the better government of India. It declared Queen Victoria as the sovereign of British India. A Secretary of State for India was appointed who was a member of the British cabinet. The company rule was abolished, and direct responsibility for the administration of the country was assumed by the British Crown. Lord Canning announced it as at a Darbar at Allahabad, and a Queen's proclamation issued on November 1, 1858. The Governor General was now to be called the Viceroy of India, representative of the Crown. The Queen's proclamation promised an end of the era of annexations and promised to respect the dignity and rights of the native princes. There was to be the freedom of religion for people of India without interference from the British officials. It promised equal opportunities in government services irrespective of race or creed. The British were now suspicious to employ the Indian soldiers, thus, the number of Indian soldiers were drastically reduced and the number of European soldiers was increased. They adopted a system of divide and rule and created separate units on the basis of caste, community, region. They called the communities martial races belonging to Punjab, Nepal, and northwestern frontier. These areas were preferred because they had proved loyal to the British during the revolt. The army was kept away from the civilian population. The Indian Civil Service Act of 1861 was passed as promised in the Queen's proclamation. It gives an impression that under the Queen all were equal irrespective of race or creed, but ground reality was different. There were racial hatred and suspicion between the Indians and the English. English newspapers and journals in Britain pictured the Indians as subhuman creatures. The structure of the Indian government was based on the notion of the master race tried to justify that Indians were white man's burden. White mutiny. The transfer of power from British East India Company to the British Crown was not easy. A section of European forces employed under the company resented the move to transfer their allegiance from the company to the Queen-ruled British Army. This resentment is called as the White Mutiny. There were two separate military forces in India before 1865 operating under the British rule. One was the Queen's Army and the other was that of the East India Company. The company's troops were given extra allowances of pay to cover various expenditures related to operations in areas other than the home territories. But those allowances were stopped, which infuriated the affected white soldiers. Because of the precarious British position in India, the demands of the European forces were accepted. Thank you. So this was all about the revolt of 1857, the first war of independence in India. So the causes before the 1857, the tribal uprisings, and the causes of 1857, and the topic of the 1857 revolt, and what are the results after the 1857 were covered. This is very important for both prelims and mains examination.